Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar, Advanced Recycling Updates 2025, Charting a Path Forward After Years of Missed Milestones. My name is Tiffany Hua, analyst here at Lux Research. I will be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague, Martian Lee, analyst here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, if you can type any questions you have in the questions box on the screen, time permitting, we will answer all questions that we can. If your questions do not get answered, please don't hesitate to email it at questions@luxresearch.inc, and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. Now let's jump on to the presentation. Over to you, Martian.
Thanks, Tiff. Welcome, everyone. My name is Martian Lee, analyst at Lux Research, and I lead Lux's coverage on advanced plastic recycling technology. Today, I'll be sharing about some updates on advanced recycling scale-up, where we are headed in the future, and what can plastic value chain stakeholders do about it. So 2025 is going to be a landmark year for plastic recycling. We see the European packaging waste regulation has already come in force. There are some milestones that the signatories to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's global commitments have to hit by the end of the year as well. We know that mechanical recycling itself is not enough for us to completely transition to a circular model for plastic consumption, and advanced recycling can potentially fill this gap. So let's start with what's at stake first. Over the past decade, over $1 billion in venture money and corporate investments have flowed into the technology sector. If we were to include other sources of funding, like private equity funding, post-IPO funding, and even government grants, the total amount of investments in advanced plastic recycling would have exceeded $10 billion. The year 2021 to 2023 were particularly fruitful, with 2023 recording an all-time high of $400 million of investment funding. And with so much money invested in this technology, with so much money involved, any sort of startup failure or bankruptcy is going to have major financial consequences. Let's take Brightmark Energy as an example. So Brightmark invested in a plastic pyrolysis plant using over $400 million worth of investments, and the plant burned through $4 million in operational expenses monthly. Unfortunately, the plant never became fully operational, and Brightmark racked up over $180 million in debt over a period of about 4 years. So today, Brightmark's subsidiary that operates this plant has declared bankrupt. And the consequences are not just financial alone. It's not just dollars and cents, because recycling, any sort of failure in recycling scale-up can have a major impact on global plastic recycling capacity. And this is especially important at a time when recycling rates have stagnated. And this means that the rate of us building up recycling capacity is pretty much in pace with the amount of plastics that we've been consuming. And any sort of capacity setback is just going to add on to the global environmental burden of plastic consumption. But before we dive into the data, let's make sure that we are on the same page. At Lux, we taxonomize advanced plastic recycling into 4 main technologies. Pyrolysis refers to technologies that heat plastic waste in an inert environment to produce a mixed hydrocarbon product called pyrolysis oil. Pyrolysis oil can then be refined into a naphtha substitute for steam cracker feedstocks. Pyrolysis covers a range of chemical depolymerization technologies, including hydrolysis, glycolysis, and methanolysis. And they're especially relevant to condensation polymers like polyethylene terephthalate, or PET. Then we have thermochemical depolymerization. Thermochemical depolymerization is very similar to pyrolysis, in which we use heat to depolymerize a plastic. But instead of producing a pyrolysis oil, we are looking to directly recover chemicals like aromatics or plastic monomers without going through the traditional steam crackers. And finally, we have dissolution technologies. These technologies use selective solvents to dissolve a very specific polymer. then physically separate it from its contaminants, and finally precipitate a purified plastic. So across these four sub-technologies, Lux has tracked over 241 scale-up announcements, totaling 9.2 million tons of advanced plastic recycling capacity. And based on the deadlines of these scale-up announcements, by the end of 2025, we can expect about 3 million tons of advanced recycling capacity. Out of these 3 million tons, 2/3 is going to be pyrolysis. There is going to be 600,000 tons of solvolysis, followed by 120,000 tons of thermochemical depolymerization capacity, and finally about 70,000 tons of dissolution capacity. If we were to expand the timeframes that we're looking at and look at our 3-year outlooks from 2022 and in 2024, you can see that 2025 is going to be an inflection point where we expect a accelerated growth in advanced plastic recycling capacity. And I think it can go two ways from here. If we were able to achieve this sudden growth in capacity or hit close to this projected growth, then the momentum in advanced plastic recycling scale-up will carry over for the latter half of the decade. We can expect a lot more investments coming in. We can expect more scale-up announcements to come between 2025 and 2030. However, if we miss this mark by a huge margin, then it's likely that value chain stakeholders can become a bit more cautious about investing in these high capex projects. They'll start to reconsider the risks in technology scale-up and perhaps even question the feasibility of some of these technologies. But for advanced plastic recycling, unfortunately, historical evidence has shown that we are very unlikely to really hit a 100% completion rate. Historically, about 60% of all pyrolysis projects were completed. For solvolysis, we do a bit better at about 72%. For thermochemical depolymerization, we fare a bit worse at about 40%. And finally, with dissolution, our completion rates is at 100%. However, the high completion rates of dissolution technologies is not because of the merits of the technology, but rather because of how few projects we have that is using this specific form of advanced plastic recycling. And so I think that we can really expect quite a lot of delays coming in the next year or so. And these are not delays that we're talking about as well, right? Lux has tracked over or confirmed about 13 projects that are cancelled or plants that have completed but are shut down. And this takes away about 1 million tons of advanced plastic recycling capacity out of the pipeline. So for example, in just the past 6 to 8 months, APK, a dissolution company, Blue Cycle, and Brightmark, plastic pyrolysis companies, have declared bankrupt. And there are companies that have also shut down their plants, like Agilix, which was operating a styrene to styrene monomer recycling plant. There's Ionica, which practices PET glycolysis. And there's also New Hope Energy that is using a plastic pyrolysis technology. These three companies have completed their plants. They've operated for a couple of years, and now they have ceased the plant operations. So from this point of view, the scale-up situation does look pretty grim, and we haven't even really gone past the first half of 2025 yet. But I would like to say that not all hope is lost, right? We should really look at the bigger picture. Ultimately, global installed advanced plastic recycling capacity has registered a net year-on-year growth. In other words, we are building more plants than shutting down. And we had some big successes in recent times as well. Let's take Eastman, for example. Eastman recently built one of the world's largest PET methanolysis plants with a capacity of 110,000 tons per year. Granted that most of these plants are not operating at full nameplate capacities yet, we also have had news of some ramp-up success. For example, ExxonMobil is operating a pyrolysis plant, Pure Cycle, which is operating a polypropylene dissolution plant they have reported that they are operating at roughly 50% of their production capacity. So to use an analogy to describe the state of advanced recycling today, advanced recycling is really like a growing child. About 10 years ago, the technology is still in its infancy, and technology developers were quick to promise everything and anything. I'm sure you've heard of promises like being able to tackle about 90% of the plastic waste in the world, promises of infinitely recyclable plastics, and of a sustainability revolution. Back then, it was a lot of potential. There's a lot of hope and dreams. But today, plastic recycling, advanced plastic recycling is a bit like a teenager, right? We have started to learn that there are boundaries and technical limits that we have to play within. And we've started to figure out what works. We've learned that there are systems in place that we should integrate with instead of trying to build everything up from scratch, for example. Or through industry partnerships, we have learned what it means to be commercially viable. And like how my colleague has very eloquently described, advanced plastic recycling is going through puberty. Right? It is messy, can be painful, and I think we're going to continue to see a few hits, a few misses, but it's all just part of growing up. So one of the biggest boundaries that I think that we're starting to learn to work with is really regulations. Some of the biggest drivers for advanced recycling technology adoption is regulations that demand either higher plastic recycling rates or they require that plastic products contain a certain amount of recycled content. However, these policies were written with mechanical recycling in mind, and sometimes advanced recycling technologies just do not fit so well within the existing policy frameworks. So there has to be some sort of changes done to make to the policies in order to accommodate this new technology. And there are three main questions that policy should try to answer. Firstly, is advanced recycling? And this is not just a matter of semantics, right? But rather it is the recognition that the recycled plastics that we derive from advanced recycling technologies will count towards any sort of mandated recycled content. This is a critical value proposition for recyclers. And this is not just applicable to chemically recycled plastics, but to mechanical recycled plastics as well. Once we've cleared this level of questioning, the second question to ask is how do we attribute recycled content? This can be quite straightforward in most cases, especially mechanical recycling. But when it comes to something like pyrolysis, it can be a bit more complicated. This is because we tend to mix pyrolysis oil with virgin naphtha feedstocks and put it into the steam cracker. And from the steam cracker, we get a range of outputs, everything from plastic monomers to waxes, solvents, and fuel. So the question here is how do we attribute the recycled feedstock going to the steam cracker to the very specific products that is coming out of the steam crackers? And this can be quite important within the European context, as I would describe later on in this webinar. And finally, the last level of questioning that we need regulations to answer is whether the recycled plastics can be food grade. And certification is important because it confirms the purity of the recycled plastics from these new technologies, and it allows recyclers to demand the highest prices for it, thereby helping with balancing plant economics. So when we take a look at the policies from a regional level, right, across three major markets, the US, the EU, and the APAC region, we can see that policies differ a lot regionally. The US is a mixed bag of policy that is largely state regulated. For example, half of the US states have enacted a so-called chemical recycling law, which recognizes chemical recycling as a form of manufacturing. So this law has not gone as far as to recognize chemical recycling as a form of recycling, but it gives technology adopters access to things like permits, grants, and financial instruments that would otherwise be denied to them if they were classified as a waste management organization. On the other hand, you also have states like Maine and Vermont, which have passed laws that completely outlaw all forms of recycling that is not mechanical recycling. In the EU, we are actually starting to see a bit more homogeneity when it comes to policy. And overall, we have started to see that the language and the tone of EU policy has started to lean towards a general acceptance of advanced recycling technologies. However, one very, very critical caveat when it comes to recycling within the EU is that fuels production or energy recovery is typically not seen as recycling. And this caveat, this clause will likely flow downwards to how we attribute recycled content, where the region is leading towards a fuels exempt form of mass balancing. And finally, in the APAC region, we do not see a lot of direct intervention from policymakers, but there is a level of implicit acceptance of the form of technology. This is mostly through how government and state-owned enterprises have embraced the technologies. They have invested in the technologies and invited technology developers to set up shop on local soil. But another thing to highlight here is that the regional differences in the regulatory landscape is not the only challenge. The policies, in fact, today are still in a very fluid state, and they can change very quickly as regulators are currently still debating over what is the best course of action. So it can be quite tough to make investment decisions today because it is not as though we can easily pack up a $100 million plant and relocate it to a different location if the local policy turns unfavorable. So I have some key takeaways to share, and you can wrap this up with some recommendations here. But let's take a quick recap. So number one, I think that global advanced plastic recycling capacity is growing, right? We're going to see a year-on-year growth. And I think I would expect to see more winners and losers emerge as the technology starts to mature. Secondly, I think that 2025 is going to be a key inflection point where it can go both ways, right? If we were to have some good outcomes in terms of capacity growth, this momentum can carry forward and we can see we can see this accelerated growth continue towards the other half of the decade. However, if we get more than expected delays, it's likely that investor enthusiasm will be impacted. We're going to start to see some questions and some pessimism enter the space, putting the brakes onto the momentum. And finally, the policy on advanced recycling can differ regionally, and it is also a very fluid situation. So there is some uncertainty over there that could hold back any sort of technology adoption. So with all this in mind, what can we do about it? I think that first and foremost, we have to recognize that advanced recycling is not just a fad, right? It is not a novelty, it is here to stay. I would even go as far as to say that advanced recycling is too big to fail. And so both government and industry must be prepared to embrace the technology in order to stay relevant in the circular economy of tomorrow. And so secondly, we have to recognize that advanced recycling scale up involves a lot more than just the reaction, just the recycling technology. Right? Upstream of the reactor, we have to think about feedstock supply, feedstock preparation, and just kind of preparing the feedstock to be in a format that is suitable for your chosen technology. And downstream of the reactor, we have to think about purification for the recycled outputs and storage of the recycled outputs before they go down to your off-takers. And in between every node on the recycling supply chain, we have to think about logistics, right? How do we transport the plastic waste from their sources to the recycling centers? And how do we transport the recycled outputs from the recycling centers to the off-takers, like the chemical companies? And as the saying goes, it takes a village to raise a child. I think it's the same thing that applies to advanced recycling. We need all the supporting elements to be in place in order for scale up to be successful. Thirdly, this may be a bit obvious, but I think that anyone in the plastics value chain should keep abreast of any sort of developments in the regulatory landscape and align with the regulatory guidance as best as you can. As described earlier, as discussed earlier, regulations is going to be a key determinant of the value of recycling technologies, right? However, there are regional differences to take note of. There's some level of uncertainty involved when it comes to advanced recycling policy. And so technology adopters have to be very selective about the regions where they choose to deploy these technologies, and they have to keep to the right side of the law. So smart policy navigation in this case will be just as important as technology choice when it comes to scaling up advanced recycling technologies. And last but not least, I think that we have to learn from the first movers and then think ahead with the next generation of technologies. For advanced recycling, the first mover advantage is pretty much over. Right, we've already built first of its kind commercial plants for each of these sub-technologies, but many early movers like Brightmark, for example, they are facing operational hurdles, they are facing bankruptcies, and they're facing some scale-up delays. So now is the time to take advantage of the experience of these early movers, right? Understand how they failed, why they failed, learn from what worked for them, and use it to inform your decisions in the technology space. Use this as metrics to assess the merits of this emerging class of next generation technologies that can potentially overcome the shortcomings of your early movers through capabilities like greater feedstock contamination tolerance, better recycled output yields, lower energy intensities, and even in some case, tunable outputs to better integrate with your downstream processes. And with that, I end my session. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and we'll open the floor now for questions.
Thanks, Martian. We will now be taking questions from the audience. You can type your questions in the questions box. If we don't get to your question on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. So we'll give it maybe a couple moments. Alrighty, got some questions. So one question focuses on maybe like the cancellations that you talked about earlier in your presentation. So why are we seeing so many scale-up delays, cancellations? Are we going to see this moving forward, or how do we kind of stop maybe, or let's say, move forward here?
Yeah. I think that the root cause of these delays or cancellations is very largely due to financial reasons, right? I've spoken with a couple of startups who have delayed their scale-up plans this year. And one of the common reasons I've heard is that due to the ongoing economic and geopolitical situation in the world, they have missed one or two investment cycles, right? And this easily set back their scale-up plans by 1 or 2 years. So it could be quite difficult to fundraise at the moment, especially when advanced recycling technologies at this point, most of them are mature, and you're looking at investments of roughly, say, $1,000 per ton of capacity. And that's going to be a very big commitment to scale up the full plant. And the second financial reason, I would say, is really the overall business case of advanced recycling technologies and how some technology adopters, technology developers find quite difficult to justify the amount of investments going into a single plant at this moment. Can come from both ends, upstream and downstream. So upstream, we are seeing some issues around feedstock supply, how the post-consumer feedstocks tend to be a lot more contaminated than expected, and this could add to operational costs. And downstream, because of the uncertainty in regulations, the end markets are not as prepared to pay a premium for the recycled plastics. And this can be quite challenging when the operational expenses of an advanced recycling plant is already that expensive. So, trying to build this business case is probably going to be the hardest thing to do. And it is the main way that you can overcome these delays and scale up hurdles.
Great. So it's a kind of about balancing out, entering the market and then scaling up. We have a relevant question here where, planning for 2025 and beyond, what projects do you see really succeed? What is the state of the scale up here? And yeah, what do you see for the future?
Yeah, I think as mentioned in the webinar, 2025 could be a year of reckoning, right? This inflection point happening where we're going to see this little growth spurt in advanced recycling capacity. But I think that we are probably going to miss that projections by quite a bit. And that is because a lot of the big capacity scale up announcements that we expect to be completed by 2025 come from companies like Brightmark and what's the other company, and New Hope Energy, right? And those two companies, I just called them out earlier for the troubles with running the existing plants today. So I'm not too optimistic that they can complete their scale up, their new plants by the end of 2025. I'm going to expect some sort of delays over there. So overall, I think we're still going to keep to our roughly 50% completion rate this year. We're still going to see some growth, but not the little growth spurt that we expect to see because of these scale-up announcements. Perhaps in about 1 or 2 years, as mentioned earlier, there were some investment cycle delays because of external factors. So perhaps we can, in 1 or 2 years, we might still see some little growth spurt because startups may be able to better raise the funding they need in the future, in the near term. But I would say that my outlook is more about being cautiously optimistic.
Great. And we'll just do one more question here. We'll focus on maybe policy. So this question is, how do you expect regional policies to harmonize globally for advanced plastics recycling?
Yeah, this is a good question because this is a matter of ongoing debate, right, between a lot of our clients, between our startups as well. And I'm of the view that we will never reach any sort of homogenized global policy on advanced plastic recycling. And we can see this already happening on the international level with the UN Plastics Treaty, right, where different countries within the UN fail to come to some sort of consensus when it comes to regulating plastic consumption. And I think the same thing is going to apply to advanced recycling policy. Probably one of the biggest differences we can see is really how fuels production will be viewed, right? As mentioned earlier, in the EU, fuel production is not really seen favorably. It's not considered as recycling. But if you were to consider the perspectives of nations within the APEC region, especially the developing nations, fuels production may not be such a bad thing after all, right? It could be seen as a strategic move towards energy security, towards self-reliance, greater self-reliance when it comes to raw materials. And so I don't think that the APEC nations especially will penalize fuel production or penalize any sort of advanced recycling technology as compared with the EU, which may take a stronger sustainability angle when it comes to the adoption of advanced recycling technologies.
Great. Thanks, Martian. So that concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentations and recording from the webinar will be sent to all attendees via email today. After leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We would appreciate any feedback you might have to help inform and improve future webinars. And take a moment and check out our upcoming webinars here on the slide. Thanks for joining and have a great day.
Thanks, Steve.